And this is John Breslin with you on Around the Northwest. Just to remind you, by the way, that on the road between Lifford and the Manor Roundabout, just to be careful at the moment, there's been a very bad oil spillage, and the advice is to take extra care there. Now, let's talk nature because Aengus Kennedy of Nature Northwest joins us and is also joining us live on Facebook. Aengus, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, John. How are we doing?
Good, good. Now the weather's taking a turn for the worse, and that obviously affects what's out and around, and affects things in nature. But up until about the last week or 10 days, it's been a very mild winter overall, and evidence of that it can be seen all around us.
It can, yeah. It's been a very mild autumn and then a very mild winter. Particularly mild, actually, the last few weeks. Up until the recent bit of stormy weather, and it's tricked a lot of nature. So it's a lot. The grass is still growing, as the farmers will still tell you in a lot of places, especially the further south in the country and the county that you go. And a lot of the flowers are starting to appear a little bit further south of us. Perhaps not so much in Donegal, but a little bit further south of us. A lot of flowers are starting to appear very early, actually. And some of the birds are starting to sing. Now, at this time of year, you get the first few of the brave ones starting anyway. They see the longer day, the more light availability. But definitely it's pronounced this year.
I mean, for centuries, flowers have been blooming like clockwork, and and just things then come into life around about to May or June, and it all looks fantastic. But since the early 1980s, it's been revealed that a lot of plants have actually grown out of sync with the seasons. And that's due to climate change. It's due to the plants sort of being tricked into thinking that this is a different time of the year to what it is.
Yeah, that's it. Because of our climate change, because of our warming planet, it's doing exactly as you say. It's tricking these plants. There's been a lot of study of this done in Ireland and a lot more again done in Britain. There's a science or a branch of science called phenology. And phenology is the study of bud burst, of when things pop out and when things start to grow and when birds start to arrive and that kind of thing. So there's been phenology going on in Ireland for the last 30 years or so, and this project has been going on in Glenveigh National Park and a few other places around the country. And they study when the birch tree, for instance, when its buds burst, and when the leaves fall off then in the autumn time. They record this at various different places. And they're seeing that the growing season is just increasing and increasing the whole time. And in Britain, what they have found is that the average flowering day is normally, or well, used to be, the end of April. So when most flowers will have popped up right across the whole season, it's the end of April is when the average flowering time is. And that's now the beginning of April. So it's shifted by a whole month. And a lot of our flowers are starting to pop up earlier. And that gives us a bit of joy and a bit of hope at this time of year, because February can still be a dark and stormy month. Yeah. But it's not so good for the rest of nature, because an awful lot of bugs come out specifically to feed on certain plants and certain flowers. And then an awful lot of birds will nest specifically to feed on those bugs. So it starts throwing off balances in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and if the buds are coming out too early, then the harsh weather hits, and they can be destroyed.
Yeah, completely. So if we get some very cold frost in the next few days now, any little buds that are out will be gone, and any little leaves that come out, because when leaves start to come out in the next few weeks, they're that beautiful light green, and we'll talk more about that now as spring rolls on, but they're very vulnerable at that stage, whereas a little bit later in the year, they're a bit tougher. So that first stage is when they're at the most vulnerable. But one thing that has started to come out now, and for anybody that's looking on Facebook, I'm just holding up a few of the little catkins. And the little catkins, or I've recently been told kittens, they're called in France, are like little fluffy tails. And they are the male flowers of the hazel tree. And a lot of trees will flower before their leaves come out. And we don't think of trees like hazel trees having big showy flowers, and they're not particularly showy flowers, but they have those very, very beautiful bright yellow catkins, and all those catkins are full of pollen. And if you see one of those trees now on your walk, stop and have a little look, because in amongst those catkins you will find some tiny, tiny red flowers. They're a deep scarlet color, and they're the size of a little match head. Think of those little red match heads that you see. They're that kind of size, and they are there ready to receive the pollen, which will be wind blown. They don't have to rely on bees, these guys. And those little flowers will turn into this year's crop of hazelnuts if it doesn't get too cold, if they don't get hammered by frost in the next few weeks.
So it's all dependent on the weather. So much depends on the weather and our climate.
Yeah, very much so. And unfortunately, and climate change, of course, such a big topic at the moment, and fuel costs and fuel heating and people feeling the pressures economically at the moment with all sorts of inflations. But one of the talks is the carbon taxes. What do we do about it? How do we tackle this climate change? How do we change behavior? And do we change our carbon taxes or not? One thing that's for sure, I don't have the right answers for that, but one thing that's for sure is the climate is changing, and we do need to change our habits dramatically. We need to put in a huge amount of effort to do this, because we can see this change that's happening already. The phenology, the studying of that bud burst has shown that, both in Britain and here, that it's knocking an awful lot of our nature out of sync.
Something else that's synonymous with this time of the year is frog spawn, and it starts to become a more commonplace. And I was just reading that the common frog is actually the only species of frog found here in Ireland. I thought we had different species of frogs, because you see different colors and obviously different sizes, but there's just the one.
Just the one. They're amazing little creatures. And they've an amazing life cycle, the frogs. We've 3 different species of amphibians that are native to Ireland. And an amphibian, people often get confused with what an amphibian is, and they mix it up with reptiles. Reptiles are different types of animal, a different class of animal to amphibians. Amphibians are cold-blooded, much like reptiles, but they've the ability to live in both water and land. And in fact, the word amphibian comes from amphibios. It's 2 Greek words, amphibios, which means living twice, or the ability to live twice, because they have a unique little way of living that when they're young, when they're in their larval stage, that frogs spawn and turns into the little tadpoles, and then they turn into a very different kind of animal that is able to come up onto land, even though it still needs to be damp. But yet we've only the one species of frog, even though they vary in size, of course, depending on their age, and they can very much vary in color.
And they can vary in color because they can change their color to suit.
They can, slowly but surely, they can change their color to the kind of habitat that they're on. They're amazing little creatures. They don't fully mature until they're around about 3 years old. So you'll often see, so the frogs will grow to 6 or 7 centimeters. People will be familiar with them, but you'll see half-size frogs, which are last year's frogs. And then you'll see little fellas in another few weeks, you'll see little fellas the size of your thumbnail by kind of April or May or so. And that's the brand new frogs that have just emerged from their tadpole phase.
So they can live to be 3 years and more.
Yeah, 3 years they're sexually mature, so that's when they start to breed. But frogs can live for 6-7 years on average, and sometimes even more, sometimes 10 or 12 years, which is kind of amazing for such a small creature. And they're hugely important. They're a really important, this is bad for the frog now, but they're a really important food source for all sorts of different animals, lots of different birds, some of the mammals as well. But then also they play a big role for us, because they eat a vast amount of pests, a vast amount of midges and other little bugs that come out of water, come out of damp places. And we think, and we know, we have a lot of midges. We would have an awful lot more if it wasn't for creatures like frogs exerting their pest control for us.
So they're breeding around now, and so it'll be a bit early yet to expect to see any frog spawn.
For us, a little bit early, and it'd be interesting to see have any listeners spotted any as yet. Already down in Cork and further down the country, they've been spotted. In fact, if you go on to, and any sightings like this you ever see, record them on Biodiversity Ireland. Biodiversity Ireland is a wonderful website, and you can easily pop your records on there. And already they've had thousands of records so far this year. And the top 3 that they've had are robins and frogs. Well, at least the top 2 that they've had, a huge amount of frogs already starting to record it down south of the country, Cork, Waterford, places like that, where the spring comes around about 2 weeks earlier than it does for us. You'd expect to start seeing them by the middle of February for us. What happens is that the males will wake up, and they will start to head from their slumber for the wintertime, and they will start to head to the same pool that they bred in last year, and for years and years. They think it's by scent that they're able to find this. And drivers in particular will notice this. At nighttime, there'll suddenly be about 3, 4, 5 nights or so where there'll be loads and loads of frogs crossing the road, crossing the ditches, crossing everywhere, yes, just trying to make a beeline to that pool where they were, where the waiting females will have arrived there, and the males will then arrive. They'll croak and croak away, calling the females, and they'll try and breed with them.
And just explain the cycle to me. It goes from spawn into tadpoles, and then the tadpoles grow until about when?
And the tadpoles grow, then takes them around about 10 weeks. So it's an amazing little cycle. So once they've been hibernating pretty much, or in a torpor all winter long, underneath piles of logs, piles of sticks, that kind of thing. Because we often talk about having messy bits in your garden. It's one of the many, many reasons that you should, because those frogs might still be asleep under those messy bits in your garden right now. And when they wake up, they've one thing in their mind, and they make the way to that pool. You'll hear, if you get to those pools just for the couple of weeks, it's an amazing sound, but it only lasts a few days, really. And you'll hear the males calling, and then they will attempt to breed with the females. The females will lay at least 2,000 eggs, the frog spawn, and the males then fertilize those immediately at the same time. And then all the males, all the females, they scatter, they distribute, and they go out about the damp parts in our gardens, the damp parts in our forests, in our fields, and they eat up the bugs for us. But meanwhile, those little eggs, and that's one of the things that makes amphibious creatures amazing, a little bit different, because the egg is effectively an embryo. It's a free-formed embryo that is living in the water, and it starts off with this tiny little egg and has to develop utterly on its own, and develops into the little tadpole creature, of course, that we know with the little tail, and it becomes carnivorous. It will eat other bugs that are in there, midgy larvae, things like that. They've even been known to feed on tadpoles, other tadpoles, if there isn't enough food. And after about 10 weeks, but that can be slower, considerably slower if the weather is cold, if we get a cold spring. But after about 10, maybe 12 weeks or so, those tiny little froglets will emerge. The tails will start to shrink back into the body. The front legs first come, and then the back legs, and then they hop out, size of your thumbnail, and they'll start to spread around.
And we're used to seeing them hopping around, but they're good swimmers as well.
Really good swimmers, really good swimmers. So again, one of those things for that amphibious nature is that they have gills under the water. So that stage, when they're that little free-formed embryo swimming around the place, they have gills. They have the ability to take oxygen out of the water, a bit like fish. But then once they emerge out of the land, they developed very basic little lungs, and they're able to breathe air a little bit like we can. But they can also take air in through their skin. They can take oxygen in through their skin. So they'll be in damp places. And we think of frogs in pools all the time. Over the next few weeks, they will be, but they're not necessarily in pools the rest of the time. They are in damp places, in wet places, but they'll be scattered all over the countryside. And it's one of the problems that things like frogs have, things like newts have, which look like tiny little lizards, but they're actually water creatures or damp creatures as well, is that we drain so many areas. And in our kind of quest to try and drain out and clear up our gardens or clear up our fields and not leave those little damp areas, we're wiping out these creatures, and we're wiping out their habitats, basically. And then, of course, we're wiping out their ability to be able to eat those pests for us.
A texter says, could you please ask Aengus why crows circle around in hundreds these days in the one place?
Yeah, crows are very social creatures, and at this time of year, they're already starting to think of the breeding season. Like quite a few of the birds, actually, quite often younger birds in particular, last year or the year before's generation, will be the ones that'll be starting to sing now and starting to try and practice their breeding rituals, I suppose. And crows are no different. They'll communicate with each other all year round. Oftentimes in the evening time, where there's big flocks of crows, you'll hear them. It can be very dramatic, can be thousands of them gathering together. And they believe that they're exchanging information about where dangers were, where good feeding grounds were, and whatnot. But also at this time of year, of course, they're starting to form their bonds as well. And they're starting to pair up with their partners. They're starting to rebuild nests that they've used in the past. So it's an optimistic sign, I think, when you see that. Because and watch out, you'll start by, if you're looking for the crows, you'll start spotting them with little twigs in their beaks from now on, and that's them starting to get ready for spring, which we're all looking forward to.
What about birds, smaller birds in our gardens? How is that at the moment? I mean, we're still not out of the woods with, in terms of harsh weather and possible snow and frost. So what have numbers been like this year?
Yeah, well, those numbers have been good. The the Birdwatch Ireland garden survey did very well. There's a lot of participants actually took part in it, which was great. And I haven't seen the final results from them, but the numbers of visiting birds are still high. So you look at the birds at your bird feeder. Hopefully most people listening now are feeding birds, leaving out some peanuts and some other food for the birds. And you'll get great rewards by all the chaffinches and the blue tits and the great tits and whatnot that come. But a lot of those birds, in particular the little chaffinches, which have the little white wing bars, they'll have come from possibly different countries altogether. They'll come from quite far away to hang out in your garden and to feed in your garden. And they're not pairing up quite yet. But anybody that's really been watching them over the last week or two might start noticing now that the colors on a lot of those small birds are starting to become a bit more brilliant. And in the next few weeks, the fighting that they'll have, they're always little tussles for the food at the bird feeders or wherever you see them in your garden. But the fighting will become a little bit stronger, a little bit more pronounced as they also, the hormones start to kick in and they start to think of pairing up. But at the moment, they're still very much in survival mode and they have to be. Don't be kidded by the song thrush that's singing at the moment. The blue tits have started singing. Most of the other birds haven't as yet. And of course, our migrants haven't arrived as yet. Very soon, the swallows, the willow warblers will be making their way back up across Africa to head up towards us. But at the moment, it's still wintertime for those birds.
Okay, brilliant. Well, more information online, your website, a wealth of information at naturenorthwest.ie. Aengus Kennedy, as always, thanks a million for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, John.
Do you currently have vacancies that need urgently filled? Have you tried various ways to find new...
Thanks, Aengus.
Thanks, Emil.
All right, sure, we'll...
you didn't come on the screen there in the end.
Didn't have time to set it up, actually. I see Porrick's name up there, so I'll get that sorted for next time. So
you had mentioned before about maybe doing a little video beforehand to promote it.
And Tyrone. All job listings will be available online at